On the afternoon of August 23, 1988, a 43-year-old American man named Clyde Lee Conrad was arrested by German police officers outside a pizzeria in the small town of Böblingen, West Germany, located roughly 15 miles south of Stuttgart. Conrad, wearing casual civilian clothes, a light blue polo shirt, khaki pants, and white tennis shoes, offered no resistance. According to the arrest report filed by the Baden-Württemberg State Police, Conrad appeared calm, almost resigned, as if he had been expecting this moment for some time. Within hours, investigators would begin to understand that they had just taken into custody the central figure in what would become one of the most damaging espionage cases in NATO history, a systematic betrayal that had compromised Western military secrets for more than a decade. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden operations of Cold War intelligence and the real human cost of espionage, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you documented cases like this every week, stories that changed history but were buried in classified files for decades. Now, let's talk about how an ordinary army sergeant became one of NATO's most damaging traitors. Clyde Lee Conrad was born on March 15, 1945, in Sebring, Ohio, to working-class parents. His father, Raymond, worked at a rubber manufacturing plant. His mother, Dorothy, raised Clyde and his two younger sisters in a modest two-story house on the east side of town. School records describe him as an average student who played junior varsity baseball and worked part-time at a local grocery store. He graduated in 1963 with respectable but unremarkable grades. That fall, with limited prospects for college and no desire to work in Sebring's factories, 18-year-old Clyde enlisted in the United States Army, seeking the stability and opportunity that civilian life in industrial Ohio couldn't provide. After basic training at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri and advanced training as an administrative specialist, Conrad received his first overseas posting to West Germany in 1965. There, he met Brigitte Müller, a German woman who worked as a secretary for a civilian contractor doing business with the American military. They began dating in spring 1966 and married that October. Their first daughter, Sandra, was born in 1968. Their second daughter, Monica, arrived in 1971. The family moved between military housing in the United States and rented German apartments during overseas assignments. By all external measures, the Conrads appeared to be living an ordinary military family life, modest but stable, unremarkable but respectable. Conrad's early Army career followed the standard trajectory of a competent non-commissioned officer. He performed his administrative duties reliably, received satisfactory evaluations, and earned promotions on schedule. In 1974, he achieved the rank of Staff Sergeant. 3 years later, in 1977, he was promoted to Sergeant First Class, a rank he would hold until his retirement. What distinguished Conrad from many peers wasn't his military bearing or leadership abilities, but rather his administrative competence and his willingness to work long hours on tasks other soldiers found tedious. He understood bureaucratic systems, knew which forms needed filing and which procedures required following. This talent made him valuable to superiors and earned him assignments involving increasing responsibility and access to classified information. In 1975, Conrad received an assignment that would prove fateful: the 8th Infantry Division headquarters in Bad Kreuznach, West Germany. His duties involved working in the division's G3 operations section, responsible for planning, training, and operational security. This posting gave Conrad access to an extraordinary range of classified documents, contingency plans for defending Western Europe against Soviet attack, troop deployment schedules, communications protocols, intelligence assessments of Warsaw Pact military capabilities. His work required him to handle these documents regularly, preparing briefing materials for senior officers, filing reports, maintaining document inventories, ensuring classified materials were properly secured. He held a secret security clearance, later upgraded to top secret as his responsibilities expanded. Background investigations before these clearances were granted found nothing concerning. No criminal record, no significant debts, no apparent vulnerabilities that might make him susceptible to foreign intelligence recruitment. What investigators hadn't found was Conrad's growing resentment about his financial situation. His military salary supported his family adequately, but didn't allow for the comfortable lifestyle he observed among German civilians of similar age and professional standing. Brigitte worked part-time, which helped, but the family lived modestly in a small apartment and drove an aging Volkswagen. Conrad later claimed during interrogations that he felt his contributions were undervalued and inadequately compensated, a resentment that made him receptive when opportunity for supplemental income presented itself. The exact circumstances of Conrad's initial recruitment remain somewhat unclear. Conrad himself provided inconsistent accounts during different interrogation sessions, and Hungarian intelligence records that might clarify the matter were never fully released after the Cold War ended. Based on Conrad's eventual confession and corroborating evidence, investigators established that sometime in 1974 or early 1975, Conrad was approached by a man he later identified as Sandor, almost certainly a work name rather than the individual's real identity. The approach occurred at a Gasthaus, a traditional German pub restaurant, in or near Bad Kreuznach. Conrad had stopped for a beer after work, a routine he followed several times weekly. The man, calling himself Sandor, struck up a conversation in fluent English with a slight accent Conrad believed might be Hungarian or Czech. The conversation was casual at first, questions about Conrad's work in general terms, observations about American and German culture, complaints about cost of living. Over several meetings that Conrad described as seemingly coincidental but were almost certainly planned, Sandor gradually steered conversations toward Conrad's access to information and his willingness to share that information in exchange for money. Intelligence analysts who later studied Conrad's case were skeptical of his claims that he initially believed the information Sandor wanted was innocuous, or that he'd been gradually manipulated into espionage. The pattern of his activities, the types of documents he accessed, the methods he used to copy and transfer information, the security measures he employed to avoid detection, suggested sophistication and intentionality inconsistent with someone who'd been tricked. The more likely explanation was that Conrad understood from very early on that he was committing treason and chose to proceed because the financial rewards outweighed, in his calculation, the risks and moral implications. The mechanics of Conrad's operation evolved over time. Initially, he would memorize information from classified documents encountered during regular duties and relay that information to Sandor during meetings at various locations around Bad Kreuznach and nearby towns. These meetings typically occurred in public places, restaurants, parks, shopping centers, where conversations between two men wouldn't attract attention. As Conrad's handlers gained confidence in his reliability and access, they provided equipment and training that allowed him to increase both volume and quality of information delivered. He received a Minox camera, a small, high-quality camera designed for covert photography and widely used by intelligence services during the Cold War. He received instructions on photographing documents without detection, how to use lighting to ensure clarity, how to photograph multiple pages efficiently, how to develop and process film or deliver undeveloped film securely. Conrad's position in the G3 operations section gave him legitimate reasons to access and handle classified documents. His challenge wasn't obtaining access, but finding opportunities to photograph documents without being observed by colleagues or security personnel. He developed a routine, identifying documents of particular interest or value, war plans, intelligence assessments, communications protocols, and finding reasons to keep those documents at his desk longer than strictly necessary. He volunteered to work late or come in on weekends when fewer people were present and security was more relaxed. He would take documents to storage rooms or supply closets on the pretext of filing or retrieving materials, and in those moments of privacy, he would photograph documents using the Minox camera, which could be concealed in his hand or pocket. One specific breach, documented during his interrogation, occurred in March 1982. Conrad obtained access to a classified annex of General Defense Plan 4-1 that outlined exactly where NATO commanders planned to establish fallback defensive positions if Warsaw Pact forces broke through initial defenses in northern Germany. The document included map coordinates, unit designations, and specific conditions under which withdrawal orders would be issued. Conrad photographed all 47 pages over 3 nights, working alone in the document control room where he had legitimate access for filing purposes. He delivered the film 2 weeks later at a dead drop near Kaiserslautern. Damage assessments prepared after his arrest concluded that this single breach gave Soviet planners detailed knowledge of NATO's defensive depth and could have allowed them to position forces to exploit exactly the withdrawal routes NATO intended to use. Film from these photography sessions would be delivered during dead drops or personal meetings with handlers. A dead drop is a location where materials can be left by one party and retrieved by another without face-to-face meetings, reducing surveillance detection risk. Conrad used several dead drop locations in and around Bad Kreuznach, including spots in public parks, parking garages, and rest areas along highways. He would place film canisters in pre-arranged hiding places behind loose bricks, inside drainage pipes, underneath particular park benches, and would signal that a delivery had been made through innocuous means, such as placing a chalk mark on a particular wall or parking his car in a designated spot. The financial compensation Conrad received was substantial by military salary standards, but modest compared to what some Cold War spies commanded. Bank records and Conrad's testimony indicate he received approximately $1,000 to $1,500 per delivery during the late 1970s, with payments increasing to $2,000 to $3,000 per delivery during the 1980s as volume and quality increased. Over roughly 13 years, Conrad likely received between $300,000 and $500,000, though the exact amount was never definitively established. Conrad's lifestyle changed noticeably during this period, though not so dramatically as to immediately raise suspicions. He purchased a newer car, a Mercedes-Benz sedan that was expensive but not outrageously so for a senior non-commissioned officer. The family moved from their small apartment to a larger, more comfortable house in a better neighborhood. He took his family on vacations to Austria and Switzerland. He invested in real estate, purchasing a rental property in Bad Kreuznach. When colleagues questioned how he could afford these things on a military salary, Conrad explained that Brigitte had received an inheritance from a deceased relative, a story plausible enough to avoid scrutiny. What Conrad's colleagues and superiors didn't know was that he had expanded his operation beyond simply photographing documents himself. Sometime around 1977 or 1978, Conrad began recruiting other soldiers to assist him. The first recruit was a fellow non-commissioned officer named Roderick Ramsay, who worked in a different section of division headquarters but had access to complementary sets of classified materials. Roderick James Ramsay was born in 1943 in Columbus, Georgia. He had enlisted in the Army in 1961 at age 18 and followed a career path similar to Conrad's: steady promotions, overseas assignments, competent performance in administrative and operational support roles. Ramsay and Conrad had met during an assignment at Fort Hood, Texas, in the early 1970s and maintained contact as their careers progressed. When both men found themselves assigned to the 8th Infantry Division in Bad Kreuznach, within months of each other in 1977, they resumed their friendship. Conrad approached Ramsay with his espionage proposition sometime in late 1977 or early 1978. The approach was gradual. Conrad would complain about money, would mention that he'd found a way to supplement his income, would gauge Ramsay's interest and receptivity. Eventually, Conrad explained that he was providing information to foreign contacts and that there was an opportunity for Ramsay to participate and share in the profits. Ramsay's motivations for joining Conrad's operation appear to have been primarily financial. He had recently gone through a divorce that left him with significant debts. He was supporting 2 children from his first marriage through child support payments. He had remarried, and his second wife was pregnant with their first child together. The money Conrad was offering, initially $500 per delivery, later increasing to $1,000 and higher, was appealing enough to overcome whatever moral or legal reservations Ramsay might have had. Ramsay's participation wasn't driven by ideology. During his interrogation, he showed no interest in political arguments about the Cold War or American foreign policy. He wanted money to pay off divorce debts, to support his children, to give his second wife a more comfortable life. The espionage was purely transactional for him, a source of income that happened to be illegal and treasonous, but that, in his compartmentalized thinking, didn't require him to see himself as a traitor. He was just doing a job and getting paid for it. The addition of Ramsay significantly expanded the operation's scope. Ramsay had access to logistics and supply chain documents, communications security materials, and information about troop movements and training exercises that complemented the operational plans and intelligence assessments Conrad was already providing. His position gave him access to logistics planning documents Conrad could not easily obtain, detailed transportation schedules showing how NATO would move reinforcements into Germany during wartime, supply chain vulnerabilities Soviet planners could exploit, maintenance records revealing which units were at reduced readiness. In one documented instance from 1982, Ramsay photographed a complete logistics assessment for a major NATO exercise called Reforger 82, which simulated rapid deployment of American forces from the United States to Europe. This single document package, according to later damage assessments, provided Soviet military intelligence with a detailed blueprint of exactly how NATO intended to reinforce its front lines during a crisis, information that could have been used to plan preemptive strikes or interdiction operations. The 2 men would coordinate their activities, with each photographing materials the other couldn't easily access, combining their deliveries to provide more comprehensive packages of information to their handlers. Conrad later recruited at least 2 additional soldiers into his network, though their identities and the full extent of their participation remained partially obscured even after the case became public. One recruit was believed to be a junior enlisted soldier who worked in signals intelligence and provided information about communications, intercepts, and cryptographic protocols. Another was believed to be a civilian contractor with security clearance who had access to technical specifications for military hardware and electronic systems. This expanded network transformed what had begun as a single spy into what U.S. Army investigators would later describe as an organized espionage ring, a coordinated, systematic effort to collect and deliver classified information on a scale far larger than any individual could have achieved alone. Between 1975 and 1985, Conrad and his accomplices are believed to have photographed and delivered more than 50,000 pages of classified documents to Hungarian and, through them, Soviet intelligence services. The information compromised by Conrad's ring included some of the most sensitive military secrets of the Cold War era. Among the documents photographed and delivered were General Defense Plan 4-1, the detailed NATO contingency plan for defending Western Europe against a Warsaw Pact invasion. This document outlined where NATO forces would be positioned, how reinforcements would be moved, what supply routes would be used, and what defensive positions would be established. With this information, Soviet military planners could identify vulnerabilities and design offensive operations specifically to exploit those weaknesses. Communications security protocols, including frequencies, call signs, authentication procedures, and encryption methods used by NATO forces. This information would allow Soviet intelligence to intercept and potentially decode sensitive military communications. Intelligence assessments of Warsaw Pact military capabilities, which revealed what NATO knew, and crucially what NATO didn't know, about Soviet and Eastern European forces. This gave Soviet planners insights into where their own security measures were effective and where they needed improvement. Troop deployment schedules and training exercise plans, which revealed when and where NATO forces would be at reduced readiness, potentially creating windows of vulnerability. Technical specifications for radar systems, anti-aircraft weapons, and armored vehicles, which could be used to develop countermeasures or to design more effective offensive systems. The damage assessment prepared by the Department of Defense after Conrad's arrest concluded that his espionage had significantly compromised the ability of NATO forces to defend Western Europe and had provided the Soviet Union with detailed knowledge of U.S. and NATO war plans, capabilities, and intentions. The assessment noted that many of the compromised plans would need to be revised or replaced at considerable expense, and with potential gaps in defensive readiness during the transition period. For roughly 10 years, from 1975 to 1985, Conrad's operation proceeded without detection. He received consistently positive performance evaluations and was regarded by superiors as reliable, competent, and trustworthy. His security clearances were periodically renewed following routine background checks that found no issues of concern. What eventually exposed Conrad wasn't a failure in his operational security or a mistake that alerted counterintelligence investigators, but rather the investigation of someone else entirely. In 1985, U.S. Army counterintelligence received information, the specific source of which remains classified, suggesting that classified documents from European-based U.S. Army units were finding their way to Hungarian intelligence. The information was vague and didn't identify specific individuals or units, but it was considered credible enough to warrant investigation. The investigation, given the code name Canopy Wing, began as a broad effort to identify potential security breaches across multiple Army facilities in West Germany. Counterintelligence agents reviewed access logs, conducted interviews with soldiers who handled classified materials, examined patterns of document requests and file retrievals, and analyzed financial records looking for soldiers whose spending patterns seemed inconsistent with their salaries. The investigation proceeded slowly, Counterintelligence work during the Cold War was resource-intensive and time-consuming, requiring meticulous analysis of vast amounts of information looking for patterns or anomalies that might indicate espionage. For more than 2 years, from 1985 to 1987, the Canopy Wing investigation produced leads that went nowhere, theories that couldn't be confirmed, and growing frustration among agents assigned to the case. Then, in spring 1987, investigators caught a break. Analysis of personnel assignments and document access patterns identified a cluster of individuals who had all worked in the 8th Infantry Division headquarters during the period when documents were believed to have been compromised. Among those individuals was Clyde Conrad, who by this time had retired from the Army but was still living in Germany. Conrad had retired from military service in September 1985 after serving 22 years. He had achieved the rank of Sergeant First Class, the Army's designation for an E7, a senior non-commissioned officer position. His decision to retire rather than continue toward the 30-year mark seemed unusual to some colleagues, but Conrad explained that he wanted to pursue business opportunities in Germany while his daughters completed their education there. After retirement, Conrad remained in the Bad Kreuznach area. He opened a small business, a store selling American food products and goods to U.S. military personnel and their families, which gave him a legitimate reason to maintain contact with active duty soldiers and to remain near military installations. This business was modestly successful and provided Conrad with a plausible explanation for his income and lifestyle. What Conrad's former colleagues didn't know was that his retirement from the Army hadn't ended. His espionage activities. He continued contact with soldiers who still had access to classified information, including Roderick Ramsay and others he had previously recruited. These individuals would provide Conrad with documents or information, which Conrad would photograph or prepare for delivery, and Conrad would handle the actual transfer to his Hungarian contacts. In effect, Conrad had transitioned from being a spy with direct access to classified materials to being the coordinator and controller of an espionage network. When Canopy Wing investigators began looking more closely at Conrad in mid-1987, they discovered several concerning patterns. Financial records showed that Conrad's income from his store was insufficient to explain his assets and spending. He had purchased a second rental property. He had made substantial cash deposits to his bank accounts that couldn't be traced to any legitimate source. He traveled frequently to Austria, which bordered Hungary and was a common location for East-West intelligence meetings and dead drops. Surveillance of Conrad began in fall 1987. Teams of investigators from U.S., Army counterintelligence and German police watched Conrad's movements, photographed his contacts, monitored his communications, and documented his activities. The surveillance was intermittent rather than continuous, a resource limitation later criticized, but it was sufficient to establish patterns. Investigators observed Conrad meeting with individuals they couldn't identify, but who behaved in ways consistent with intelligence tradecraft. These meetings would occur in public locations, would last only a few minutes, would involve exchanges of packages or envelopes, and would be preceded by counter-surveillance behavior, such as Conrad taking circuitous routes or stopping to check if he was being followed. One particular meeting, observed and photographed in February 1988, would become central to the prosecution. Conrad drove to a parking area near a shopping center in Kaiserslautern, roughly 25 miles north of Bad Kreuznach. He parked his car and walked to a bench near the parking area's edge. After sitting for approximately 5 minutes, another man approached, medium height, dark hair, wearing a long coat despite the mild weather. The two men appeared to have a brief conversation, though surveillance teams couldn't get close enough to hear what was said. The other man handed Conrad a folded newspaper. Conrad handed the man a small package, perhaps 4 inches by 6 inches, wrapped in brown paper. The exchange took less than 30 seconds. The two men then separated, walking in different directions. Surveillance teams followed the unknown man to a car parked several blocks away. He drove east toward the Austrian border. German police, coordinating with U.S. Army investigators, attempted to follow, but lost him in traffic near Mannheim. Analysis of photographs taken during surveillance suggested the unknown man might be Imre Kunkli, a known Hungarian intelligence officer who had been photographed during previous surveillance operations in Austria. The newspaper and package exchange was classic espionage tradecraft. The newspaper likely contained instructions, questions, or requests for specific information. The package likely contained film or documents Conrad was delivering. The public location, the brief duration, the counter-surveillance measures, all indicated professional intelligence work rather than innocent business dealings. But surveillance alone wasn't sufficient for prosecution. What investigators needed was evidence that could be presented in court. Documents, testimony, confessions, physical evidence linking Conrad to specific classified materials he shouldn't have possessed. Obtaining that evidence would require either catching Conrad in the act of transferring classified information or obtaining his cooperation through interrogation. The decision was made to arrest Conrad and to search his residence and business premises. The arrest would need to be coordinated with German authorities, as Conrad was living in Germany and would be subject to German law, even though his alleged crimes included offenses against the United States. The German government, after being briefed on the investigation, agreed to prosecute Conrad under German law if sufficient evidence could be obtained, while also allowing U.S. Army investigators access to Conrad for interrogation purposes. German police took Conrad into custody while he was away from his home and business, allowing investigators to execute search warrants at both locations simultaneously without giving him opportunity to destroy evidence. The search of Conrad's home, a 3-bedroom house in a residential neighborhood of Bad Kreuznach, produced significant evidence. Investigators found a Minox camera and associated photography equipment hidden in a locked toolbox in Conrad's garage. The camera contained partially exposed film that, when developed, showed photographs of what appeared to be military documents, though the resolution was insufficient to determine their classification level or specific content. They found $47,000 in U.S. currency hidden in a false bottom of a dresser drawer in Conrad's bedroom. The bills were primarily hundreds and fifties, and the serial numbers suggested the money had been obtained through multiple sources rather than from a single withdrawal or transaction. They found notebooks containing what appeared to be coded messages or instructions. The codes used standard substitution methods that suggested intelligence tradecraft rather than personal diary keeping or business records. They found contact information for several individuals whom investigators would later identify as Hungarian intelligence officers or as intermediaries used for communication between Conrad and his handlers. They found correspondence with Roderick Ramsay and other former soldiers, some of which contained references to materials and deliveries that seemed inconsistent with Conrad's claimed business activities. The search of Conrad's business premises produced additional evidence, including receipts and financial records showing deposits that didn't match his reported sales, and a filing cabinet containing what appeared to be lists of classified document titles and access procedures, information that Conrad would have no legitimate reason to possess as a retired soldier running a food import business. Conrad was taken to a detention facility where he was interrogated by a joint team of U.S. Army counterintelligence agents and German police investigators. The interrogations began on August 24, 1988. the day after his arrest, and continued intermittently over the next several weeks. Conrad's initial response to questioning was denial. He claimed he had no knowledge of espionage. He claimed the money found in his home was from his business profits and from legitimate investments. He claimed the Minox camera was a hobby device he used for general photography. He claimed the notebooks contained personal notes and reminders rather than coded intelligence information. The interrogators didn't believe these explanations, but they also recognized that Conrad was unlikely to confess without being confronted with overwhelming evidence. They showed him the surveillance photographs from the February meeting in Kaiserslautern. They showed him analysis of his financial records demonstrating that his reported income couldn't account for his assets. They informed him that other individuals had already been arrested and were cooperating with investigators. This last piece of information was partially fabricated. Ramsay had been identified and was under surveillance but hadn't yet been arrested, but it had the desired effect. Conrad's confidence began to erode. He asked about the possibility of a plea agreement. He asked what sentence he might face if convicted of espionage charges. The interrogators explained that under German law, which would govern his prosecution, since he was arrested in Germany for activities that occurred primarily on German soil, espionage could carry a sentence of up to 15 years imprisonment. However, if Conrad cooperated fully, if he provided complete details about his activities, identified his accomplices and handlers, and helped investigators understand the full scope of the damage his operation had caused, they would recommend a more lenient sentence. On September 7, 1988, 15 days after his arrest, Conrad indicated he was willing to provide a statement. Over the next several days, he was interrogated for dozens of hours, during which he provided what investigators considered a substantially complete account of his espionage activities from 1975 through 1988. Conrad confirmed that he had been recruited by Hungarian intelligence, acting on behalf of Soviet intelligence. In 1975, he confirmed that he had photographed and delivered thousands of classified documents over 13 years. He confirmed that he had recruited Roderick Ramsay and at least 2 other soldiers into his network. He identified his primary handlers, including the man called Sandor and others he had met over the years, and provided descriptions and, in some cases, photographs of these individuals. He described the mechanics of his operation in detail, the dead drop locations, the signaling methods, the payment procedures, the security measures he had employed to avoid detection. He provided information about the types of documents he had been asked to obtain and about specific intelligence requirements his handlers had emphasized. What Conrad was less forthcoming about was his motivations. When asked why he had committed treason, Conrad offered the kinds of rationalizations common among espionage defendants. He had needed money to support his family. He hadn't believed the information he was providing would actually harm American security. He had been manipulated by his handlers into continuing long after he wanted to stop. But under sustained questioning, a different picture emerged, of a man who had enjoyed the sense of importance his espionage gave him, who had appreciated the respect his handlers showed him, who had taken pride in his ability to evade detection for so long. Conrad's confession provided investigators with the foundation they needed to expand their investigation. Roderick Ramsay was arrested in October 1988. Confronted with evidence from Conrad's confession, and with surveillance showing his continued contact with Conrad after Conrad's retirement, Ramsay also agreed to cooperate. He provided additional details about the operation, confirmed much of what Conrad had said, and helped investigators identify some of the other participants in the network. 2 other soldiers, whose names were never publicly released, though military court records identify them by initials, were also arrested and charged with espionage-related offenses. One pleaded guilty to unauthorized disclosure of classified information and received a sentence of 8 years in military prison. The other contested the charges, but was convicted at court-martial and received a sentence of 12 years. The prosecution of Conrad and his co-conspirators revealed the extent of the damage their espionage had caused. Defense Department damage. Assessors concluded that Conrad's ring had compromised detailed information about NATO's strategy for defending Western Europe, which would have allowed Soviet military planners to design offensive operations specifically calibrated to exploit identified weaknesses. They had compromised communications protocols and cryptographic systems that protected sensitive military communications, potentially allowing Soviet intelligence to intercept and decode classified information. They had compromised intelligence about Warsaw Pact military capabilities that revealed the sources and methods used to collect that intelligence, potentially allowing the Soviet Union to protect those capabilities more effectively or to feed disinformation through compromised channels. They had compromised information about troop readiness, training levels, equipment availability, and supply chain vulnerabilities that could have been exploited during a crisis. The assessment concluded that if war had broken out between NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the period when Conrad's espionage was active, the compromised information could have given Soviet forces significant tactical and strategic advantages, potentially resulting in higher casualties among NATO forces and greater difficulty in mounting an effective defense. Clyde Conrad was tried in German federal court in Koblenz beginning in May 1990. The trial lasted 3 months and included testimony from dozens of witnesses, including U.S. Army personnel who described the classification levels and significance of documents Conrad had compromised, intelligence analysts who explained how the information could have been used against U.S. interests, and Conrad's former colleagues who described his access and activities. Conrad's defense attorney argued that Conrad had been motivated not by hostility toward the United States, but by financial need, and that he hadn't fully understood the implications of his actions. The attorney emphasized Conrad's cooperation with investigators after his arrest and his expressed remorse for the harm he had caused. The prosecution argued that Conrad had engaged in systematic, calculated espionage over more than a decade, that he had recruited others into his conspiracy, that he had enriched himself through betraying his country and his fellow soldiers, and that the damage he had caused to national security was severe and enduring. On June 6, 1990, Conrad was convicted on multiple counts of espionage and related offenses. On June 21, 1990, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, the maximum sentence available under German law at the time. The judge, in explaining the sentence, noted the extraordinary scope and duration of Conrad's espionage, the grave damage to the security interests of the Federal Republic of Germany and its NATO allies, and Conrad's abuse of the trust placed in him as a non-commissioned officer in the United States Army. Roderick Ramsay was tried separately and was convicted in November 1990. He received a sentence of 14 years imprisonment. The judge in Ramsay's case noted that while Ramsay had been a participant in Conrad's conspiracy and bore responsibility for his actions, he had played a subordinate role and had been recruited by Conrad rather than initiating espionage on his own. The consequences of Conrad's espionage extended far beyond the courtroom. For the U.S. Army and for NATO, the Conrad case necessitated a comprehensive review of security procedures and a massive effort to replace or revise the compromised operational plans and protocols. This effort took years and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. For the intelligence community, The Conrad case highlighted vulnerabilities in the security clearance and monitoring systems that had allowed Conrad to operate undetected for so long, despite multiple indicators that should have raised suspicions: his overseas contacts, his unexplained wealth, his continued access to sensitive areas after retirement through his business contacts with active duty soldiers. But the most profound consequences were felt by individuals whose lives were disrupted or destroyed by Conrad's choices, not only Conrad himself and his immediate family, but also the families of his co-conspirators and the soldiers who had trusted him as a colleague and mentor. Brigitte Conrad, who had been married to Clyde for more than 2 decades, claimed during police interviews and later court proceedings that she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities. Investigators found no evidence to contradict this claim. Brigitte had worked part-time, had raised their 2 daughters, and had believed her husband's explanations for their improving financial circumstances. She was one of the secondary victims, someone who had no knowledge of her husband's crimes but would bear their consequences. The impact on their daughters, Sandra and Monica, was similarly devastating. Sandra was 20 years old when her father was arrested. Monica was 17. Both were attending school in Germany at the time. Documents from teachers and counselors show that both young women struggled profoundly with their father's arrest and conviction. They faced questions from peers and community members about what they had known, whether they had been involved, whether they had benefited from the money their father had received for his espionage. Sandra, who had been planning to attend university, postponed her education and instead took a job working in retail. She rarely spoke about her father's case and declined interviews with journalists who periodically contacted the family. Monica, who had been more outgoing and social before her father's arrest, became withdrawn and isolated. School counseling records obtained years later by researchers studying the impact of parental criminal convictions showed that Monica struggled with depression and anxiety that required medical treatment. Brigitte divorced Clyde in 1992, 2 years after his conviction. She reverted to her maiden name of Miller and moved to a different town in Germany where she was less likely to be recognized or associated with the Conrad case. She never remarried. She worked as an administrative assistant for a small company and lived quietly, maintaining contact with her daughters, but avoiding any public discussion of her former husband or his crimes. For Roderick Ramsay's family, the consequences were equally difficult. Ramsay had been married to his second wife, Linda, for 11 years when he was arrested. They had 2 children together, ages 8 and 10, and Ramsay was still paying child support for 2 children from his first marriage. Linda hadn't known about her husband's espionage activities. When confronted with the evidence and with Ramsay's confession, she felt betrayed not only by his crimes, but by his deception, by the years of lying, by his willingness to put their family at risk for money, by his fundamental dishonesty about who he was and what he was capable of. Linda divorced Ramsay while he was awaiting trial in 1990. She moved with their children back to the United States, settling in North Carolina, where she had family support. Court records related to custody and child support show the children were told that their father had made serious mistakes that required him to be in prison, but the full extent of his espionage wasn't explained to them until they were older. Both children struggled in school and in social relationships, dealing with a sense of loss and confusion about their father's absence and the circumstances that had caused it. The 2 other soldiers who were convicted in the Conrad case also left behind families who became collateral damage. One was married with 3 children. His wife filed for divorce while he was in military prison. The other was unmarried but had been supporting his elderly mother. After his conviction, she lost that financial support and eventually had to move into subsidized housing. Clyde Conrad remained in German prison for the rest of his life. He was incarcerated initially at Diez Prison, a medium-security facility in Rhineland-Palatinate, and later transferred to Bruchsal Prison in Baden-Württemberg. Prison records indicate Conrad was compliant with rules, participated in work assignments, and caused no disciplinary problems. He had limited contact with his family. His daughters visited him occasionally during the first 2 years of his imprisonment, but these visits became increasingly difficult for everyone involved. Sandra later described in a letter to a journalist the experience of sitting across from her father in a prison visiting room, trying to find something to talk about while avoiding the questions she wanted to ask but couldn't bring herself to voice. "How could you do this? Didn't you think about us? Was the money worth it?" Monica stopped visiting after the first year. Brigitte visited twice, once shortly after his conviction to discuss divorce proceedings, and once several years later to provide closure, then never returned. In February 1998, Clyde Conrad suffered a heart attack in his prison cell at Bruchsal Prison. Prison medical staff responded but were unable to revive him. He was pronounced dead at approximately 3:15 a.m. on February 8, 1998. He was 52 years old. Conrad's death received minimal news coverage. Most obituaries noted only that he had been an American soldier convicted of espionage who had died while serving a life sentence in a German prison. There was no analysis of his life, no attempt to understand his motivations or to contextualize his choices within the broader Cold War framework. His body was cremated, and according to German prison authorities, his ashes were claimed by his daughters and reportedly scattered at a location in Germany that was not disclosed. There was no funeral service. Roderick Ramsay served his 14-year sentence in German prison and was released in 2004. He was deported to the United States immediately upon release, as his conviction made him ineligible to remain in Germany. He returned to the southern United States, where family members helped him find employment doing manual labor for a construction company. He lived quietly, avoiding publicity and declining all interview requests. People who knew him after his release reported that Ramsay expressed regret for his actions and acknowledged the harm he had caused, but he struggled to rebuild any kind of normal life. His relationship with his children from his second marriage remained strained. They maintained minimal contact, and according to later accounts, there was a fundamental barrier between them, a sense that the person they had thought was their father had been revealed to be someone else entirely. The damage Conrad caused to NATO and U.S. military security has been difficult to quantify precisely, but several facts are clear. The operational plans he compromised had to be revised or replaced at enormous cost. The communications protocols he exposed had to be changed, requiring new equipment, new training, and new procedures. The intelligence capabilities he revealed had to be adjusted to account for the possibility that the Soviets now understood NATO's sources and methods. More fundamentally, the Conrad case undermined trust within military organizations. After his exposure, security procedures were tightened significantly, background checks became more thorough, access to classified materials was more closely monitored, financial disclosure requirements were expanded, and counterintelligence resources were increased. These measures were necessary but also created an atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance that some veterans of that era describe as corrosive to unit cohesion and morale. What is certain is that Conrad's espionage represented a profound betrayal of trust, not just institutional trust in security systems and clearance procedures, but personal trust between soldiers who rely on each other in ways that civilians rarely experience. The soldiers who worked with Conrad, who befriended him, who trusted him with their own secrets and vulnerabilities, learned that he had been systematically betraying them for years while maintaining a facade of loyalty and professionalism. The question of why Clyde Conrad committed espionage has no simple answer. The financial motivation was real. He received hundreds of thousands of dollars over 13 years. But many people face financial pressures without turning to treason. The grievances about recognition and compensation that he expressed during interrogations may have been genuine. But countless soldiers serve with distinction without requiring constant validation. More likely, Conrad's espionage resulted from a combination of factors: financial pressure that created receptiveness to recruitment, gradual moral compromise that made each subsequent betrayal easier than the last, psychological satisfaction from feeling valued and important to his handlers, and compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain his identity as a good soldier and good father, while simultaneously betraying his country and putting his family at risk. The tragedy of the Conrad case extends beyond the classified documents that were compromised or the military plans that had to be revised. The deeper tragedy lies in the destruction of families, the betrayal of trust, and the realization that the ordinary life Conrad maintained was built on deception that eventually collapsed and buried everyone connected to him. Sandra Conrad, who watched her father receive a life sentence when she was 22 years old, later told a researcher studying children of convicted spies that she spent years trying to reconcile two incompatible images: the father who had coached her softball team and attended her school plays, and the traitor who had sold military secrets for money. She never succeeded. The father, she remembered, felt like a fiction. The spy he'd been felt like a stranger. Monica Conrad refused all interview requests and never spoke publicly about her father. According to her sister, Monica preferred simply not to think about their father at all, not as a way of forgiving or understanding him, but as a way of protecting herself from the pain and confusion his actions had caused. Brigitte Conrad. In one of the very few statements she made about her ex-husband after his conviction, told a journalist in 1995 that the hardest part hadn't been learning about the espionage itself, but rather understanding that the man she had been married to for more than 20 years had been living a double life, had been lying to her every day, and had valued money more than he valued their family's safety and well-being. She said she would never understand how someone could do that and still look their spouse and children in the eye each morning and act as if everything was normal. The question of responsibility in cases like Conrad's is complex because it requires us to assign accountability among individuals operating within systems that shaped their choices. Conrad chose to commit espionage, and he bore responsibility for that choice and its consequences, but he made that choice within a Cold War context that created markets for classified information within military and intelligence systems that granted access to thousands of people while relying on imperfect monitoring, and within a culture that emphasized loyalty to unit and country while also promoting individual ambition and material success. His Hungarian handlers were operating within an intelligence system that treated human assets as tools to be exploited for strategic advantage. The U.S. Army security systems that failed to detect his activities for so long were designed by people working with limited resources and incomplete understanding of human behavior. The FBI and Army counterintelligence investigators who eventually exposed him were constrained by legal and practical limitations on their ability to surveil and investigate American citizens and soldiers. All of these factors contributed to outcomes that harmed people who had limited or no agency in the situation. Brigitte Conrad, Sandra Conrad, Monica Conrad, Linda Ramsay, the Ramsay children, and the families of other co-conspirators. These secondary victims made no choices that led to their suffering. They simply had the misfortune of being connected to someone who made catastrophically destructive decisions. Clyde Conrad was 43 years old when German police arrested him outside a pizzeria on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He was 52 when he died in a prison cell, having spent the last decade of his life confined to institutions in a country that wasn't his own, serving a life sentence for crimes that enriched him by perhaps $500,000 and destroyed everything else he had built. His daughters scattered his ashes at a location they never disclosed. His ex-wife released no statement. The NATO war plans he sold became obsolete when the Soviet Union collapsed 3 years into his sentence. What remained was a family that would never recover, a security apparatus that would never again trust as easily, and a cautionary tale about the distance between who we appear to be and who we actually are when we believe no one is watching.